for 36 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation there. I am Julian Röpke, and this is BILD Situation Room. We begin with images from the central Russian region of Saratov. Yesterday, another long-range drone from Ukraine crashed there, and not just anywhere, but at a Gazprom facility responsible for transmitting gas towards the west. Here we can quite clearly see the Lyuty drone, a long-range drone operated by the Ukrainian Air Force, which is being deployed. And it's interesting, the workers can only watch the whole situation unfold. They're standing there quite calmly, observing as the drone dives into its final approach. And then a big boom, and suddenly the people start running away because they realize something has happened. However, we can see that the damages are relatively minor. Here we see the smoke rising from that facility over there. But the distance, once again, is absolutely impressive that Ukraine has covered here, because we are nearly 1,500 kilometers away from Ukraine. We're examining the entire situation on the map and can clearly see here. The drone has covered a remarkably long and impressive distance. Specifically, we can see that quite clearly up there. Those are the kilometer markers we're seeing, and it shows the distance the drone has at least traveled. As mentioned, we're near the city of Saratov, southeast of Moscow, and this is yet another long-range strike carried out by the Ukrainian army. At the moment, we don't know whether the gas flows have been completely halted here. However, we do know that since this morning, yet another power plant in Moscow has been engulfed in flames. Named CHP-16, a Gazprom site, started to burn on Thursday morning. We will keep an eye on that, for whatever reasons. Further infrastructure facilities, especially critical infrastructure related to gas, coal and fuel in Russia, are becoming targets of Ukrainian attacks. From Saratov, we're moving on to Kursk, getting closer to Ukraine, and here we have current footage from Sudzha, the last city that remained under Ukrainian control until the very end. Now we see Russian drone footage of the city showing that, yes, completely destroyed, at least large parts of it, but we can see the Russian flag waving here. And it is a very similar fate that this city has suffered, just like other so-called liberated cities by Russia. Namely, we have this complete destruction. Many roofs are no longer covered. Still, Russia has retaken this town, a small place, once 6,500 residents. The Ukrainians are reportedly still fighting west of it. We'll now take a closer look at the map for details. That the Ukrainians haven't fully withdrawn yet. Yesterday it was already said that they had completely withdrawn from Kursk. Today it's being said again that they're still fighting, but no longer in Sudzha, only in some small villages between Sudzha, which is already relatively close to the border, and the Ukrainian border. That was the situation 10 days ago. And now we're moving into the current situation as seen by our map provider, Deep State Map here. Namely that Sudzha, as you can see here, is under Russian control. However, there are still some small areas remaining, both west of Sudzha and here around Guyevo. It's quite interestingly situated because there's a river that goes around it. The Russians face difficulties crossing from their side, so these areas remain under Ukrainian control. However, we know from recent days that the information always comes a few hours, sometimes even a few days later. While we still see yesterday's status from Deep State Map, the situation may already have changed today, with Ukrainians retreating further towards Sumy, so further into their own territory. From Russia, we move into Ukraine, return to the Donbass, and take a look here at how another Russian tank attack, or at least an armored personnel carrier attack, was thwarted near Torezk. We've repeatedly pointed out that the Russians are running low on vehicles, and that remains the case today. Nonetheless, here they were able to mobilize a total of 4 vehicles once again. Here we see these are various vehicles as well, probably a tank among them with mine rollers. And now we also see how the Ukrainian drones are attacking this convoy here, taking them out one after the other. We see it clearly, yes. These so-called turtles or garages, each time targeting heavily armored vehicles or at least fortified ones, attacking them, you see. And we see somehow one after the other. First, second, third. Not just being halted in their tracks, but also being attacked, and then also catching fire and burning up. Once again, 4 vehicles deployed, 4 vehicles completely destroyed and taken out by Ukrainian forces. This time we'll let it play out. We've got it now. This one's attempting to flee even though it's already heavily damaged. We've pixelated it, of course, but it's crucial to remember that each of these tanks or infantry fighting vehicles could hold up to 10 soldiers on board, which translates to nearly 40 infantrymen in total, who were supposed to be deployed but then, of course, got stuck somewhere, stranded where the tanks couldn't advance further, and are now being systematically hunted down one by the Ukrainian army forces, who are now systematically attacking and targeting the various Russian infantrymen who were supposed to be transported from point A to point B. The footage, as I mentioned earlier, some of which we have to pixelate. Frequently, we get extremely close-up shots because the drones have such high-quality cameras with telephoto lenses. We, of course, don't show that. Nonetheless, one must be aware that even in such an attack, not all 100% of the vehicles were lost again. But also, it's not entirely clear to say, but perhaps around 50% of the Russian men deployed here have also lost their lives in this further attack near Torezk. Let's take a look at this on the map. It's also quite interesting to see that this attack did not succeed directly in Torezk. There's currently a counter-offensive by the Ukrainian army underway in that area, which is why we're seeing these large territories that are no longer entirely red. Torezk here, as you can see, its city territory was completely under Russian control about a month ago, entirely red. And now we have the orange areas, the contested zones, but what we just witnessed was a Russian assault advancing directly in this specific direction here. In other words, there was an attempt to bypass the urban area where these very drone surveillance by the Ukrainians is indeed very effective, and they tried to flank the whole thing once again. And the Ukrainians, currently stationed mainly here in the north and attacking towards Torezk from there, tried to attack them from the side, but that didn't work out either. Because we see that a Ukrainian drone unit was waiting here, and, well, we only saw around, roughly 20 impacts. We know, however, that both the Ukrainians and the Russians have a success rate of at most 50% with FPV attacks. And that means there were probably 50, 60, 70 drones were deployed, which ultimately led to the result we just witnessed. From Torezk, we move near Velika Novosilka. There, the Russian army has taken control of another very small village. However, we can see that the advance of the Russian army hasn't been stopped everywhere. As we know, near Pokrovsk, near Torezk, and also near Kupiansk, the Ukrainians are partially on the counter-offensive, even recapturing some villages. We've talked about this time and again. But here, north of Velika Novosilka, in a small village known as Dnipro area, the Russians have launched their attack. And, they're now planting their flag on one of the destroyed houses, essentially marking it as theirs to show that even this small village is under their control. We'll check the map shortly, as if the Russians continue advancing in this direction, it could seriously threaten the Ukrainian army. We can see once again just how tiny these villages really are. That's likely the reason why the Ukrainian army doesn't focus much on this area, prioritizing the defense of larger cities over these very small settlements. Nevertheless, let's take a look at it on the map. The whole situation carries a certain level of risk because after the loss of Velika Novosilka, the Russians are now primarily advancing toward the north. That means we've already seen in recent days or weeks how Novi Komar was captured. Here's another location, Skudne. I believe it was on March 3rd. And now, of course, we're seeing Dnipro area right here. And we see where the Russians want to go, namely to Koma here in the north, because through Koma runs another crucial supply route. We see it here marked a bit thicker, and this road leads towards the east, towards Andrivka and into the Kurakov area, broadly speaking, already under Russian control. That means the Russians are attempting to launch an offensive here, aiming to gain the opportunity to disrupt further Ukrainian supply efforts and logistics moving eastward from that specific region. And it's a strategy, to be honest, that has already succeeded for them in many cases so far. So we see here in Velika Novosilka, the situation remains critical for the Ukrainian army. Different, and we only want to look at this on the map today, in Pokrovsk, the front remains relatively stable there. We've received confirmed reports indicating that the entire industrial zone of the small town of Peshane is now fully under Ukrainian control. That means we haven't observed the Russian counter-movements once more in reaction to the current situation here now. There are now 4 key areas where the Ukrainians have successfully returned, softening the front around Pokrovsk and completely halting Russian advances. In the past few days, we've seen how the Russians have tried to adapt to this, meaning they've been using drones much more and relying less on infantry. Previously, the focus was mainly on advancing quickly. However, we now have brand new footage from this morning showing that the industrial area of Peshane is being targeted by Russian glide bombs. This means we assume it is firmly under Ukrainian control and that the counter efforts here were not successful. The situation has been a bit different, as we've mentioned in recent days, in Shevchenko, a larger village. With, I think, around 3,000 residents once Ukraine couldn't fully liberate it. Heavy fighting continues there, but the final outcome remains entirely uncertain. We don't know if the Russians can manage to secure the area and maintain their position there, or whether the Ukrainians will manage to push back near Pokrovsk and ultimately succeed in regaining full control over that specific area. Unfortunately, we now have to view more images not directly tied to the war, yet still part of Putin's campaign against Ukraine, though not military targets, that are under attack here. We have new footage from Kryvyi Rih. a village in central Ukraine. And now we're seeing a large building here. This is the Hotel Druzhba, which translates to the Hotel Friendship, if you will, that stands here, constructed and established in this location. The Russians claim once again that foreign mercenaries were housed here, and that's why, as we'll see shortly in the footage, a ballistic missile strike has now been carried out. We're looking at it from above at half speed, which makes it very hard to see. We observe a large Iskander missile being launched directly at the hotel, striking the forecourt area, not the main building itself. And now we can see in the before and after footage the extent of the destruction caused here. We have at least 1 fatality and 5 injured, as far as I understood, which also somewhat points to, or it suggests that the hotel wasn't packed with foreign mercenaries, but rather was just a regular hotel, which, given the ongoing war, was relatively sparsely occupied or had very few guests staying there at the time. Nonetheless, another hotel after the Hotel Central, or rather the Central Hotel in Kryvyi, which was attacked a week ago, here another hotel in the city of Kryvyi, is being specifically targeted by the Russians. From the before and after shots we see, it wasn't the building itself that was hit, but rather the restaurant located right here in front. So it's now just a pile of rubble. Fortunately, at least it seems that way if we assume the number is correct, that only 1 person was killed. The restaurant apparently wasn't very busy at that moment. On the topic of defending against these and other Russian air attacks, let's take a look at 2 videos from the Ukrainian army. One video, which is very, very recent and quite attention-grabbing, we've seen, namely from an IRIS-T system. These IRIS-T systems are delivered from Germany, various types. This here is an SLM, a system known for its relatively large range. They were strategically positioned across the country, each one protecting an area with a radius of approximately 40 kilometers around it. But even 40 kilometers are not that much and require missiles to fly somewhat close to it, so they must be targeting something in the area or fly by accidentally. We're seeing it now. We're seeing a Russian cruise missile. Here comes one marked in black. I'm trying to mark it again. This here is a Russian cruise missile, for example, of the Caliber type, which moves relatively fast, though nowhere near as fast as missiles. So it's about 900 kilometers per hour, not like the Iskander with its multiple supersonic speeds. And exactly such systems are targeted by IRIS-T. Here we see it, that's the IRIS-T system supplied by Germany. We now see how the defense missile takes off. These are extremely costly defense missiles, with each one priced at nearly €1 million. And we're about to see right here, just there, we see it from the bottom right. The cruise missile is coming, and from the left, the IRIS-T missile. And we can now see just there the missile very effectively strikes, successfully taking out the cruise missile. Let's run that again and thereby assess the situation or the threat to the respective target. It's often Ukraine's critical infrastructure, like the rail network. Ukrainians praise the IRIS-T system, claiming it achieves a 100% hit rate if you are actually capable of attacking the target. For that, as I just said, various prerequisites need to be in place. The Ukrainians are very pleased with the IRIS-T system, but still need a significantly larger number of rockets. Currently, we are delivering a low double-digit number of units every single month to Ukraine. And when you consider what the Russians are firing, that sometimes only lasts for a few days. Therefore, the Ukrainians are naturally grateful for any kind of supplies they receive here. Finally, we want to take a look at another German system that is currently being deployed to support Ukraine, specifically a vehicle. The Gepard anti-aircraft tank. The Ukrainians have now created a new, small presentation, so to speak. They're showcasing the Gepard in action. 57 units were delivered from Germany. And in contrast to what we just saw, the Gepard tanks are not necessarily suited for shooting down cruise missiles, but rather drones. That means the large kamikaze drones, with their extensive 800-kilometer range, are known as the Geren 2 and Geren 1. They are being targeted by these air defense tanks here all over the country. They are stationed at secret locations, but still in places where it's assumed these drones will pass by, because the range here is significantly lower than what we've just witnessed. We mentioned it with IRIS-T, it's 40 kilometers. With the Gepards, it's only about 5 kilometers. And quite interesting here, you can take a quick look at it. Let's just hold it up briefly. The Ukrainians have published it, so it's no longer a secret. We still have, here it says altitude and here it says speed of each target, which means the Ukrainians have, or the Germans, the Bundeswehr hasn't translated this into Cyrillic, the whole thing into Ukrainian, but we still have the letters familiar to us as well as speeds, which are listed here. That means the Ukrainians have managed, quite obviously, despite having German displays, to handle the respective targets, and as a result have been extremely effective in taking Russian kamikaze drones out of the sky. We'll see some takedowns now. Most drones come at night. Insofar as the recordings also demonstrate that they occurred at night, the Ukrainians are reportedly also extremely pleased with this particular vehicle, they say. They want even more, as they haven't just received some from Bundeswehr stocks, but also directly from industry supplies themselves. One must never forget, in the Bundeswehr, it was decommissioned. That means it's no longer used by us. Probably based on these recordings and the experience from Ukraine, there are some in the Bundeswehr and the Ministry of Defense who are currently thinking about it, whether one might perhaps consider reintroducing the Gepard anti-aircraft tank. Finally, one last video, a video that clearly demonstrates that not all Russian fiber optic drone attacks are successful, as they promise. We have a video that has fallen into the hands of the Ukrainians, which once again shows them a situation that one might perhaps recognize from the Russians, just entirely different. A fiber optic drone in perfect quality, no fuzziness. Unlike earlier with the Ukrainians, that was a radio connection. Once again, a truck is being attacked with a delta on it. That means we're assuming that this attack occurred somewhere here in Sumy or in Kursk. However, and the Russians probably wouldn't show us this, but the Ukrainians have released it, we can now see here that the impact mechanism simply isn't working. That means we have a shell down here. We also have these wires up front. I think you can see it now. These wires that, in theory, when they come together, should cause an explosion and thus destroy the vehicle. However, we see here that was the first attack. Now comes the second one a bit further up. This one also doesn't work, and then the video ends shortly after. That means even with the fiberglass drones, which the Russians always suggest to us are absolutely superior. And based on these recordings, you also get the impression that it's easier, at least for the operator, to see where his target is. But nonetheless, according to Ukrainian soldiers we spoke with, these drones also have a remarkably high error rate, and far from all of their intended attacks are actually successful, which initially appear as though a vehicle has been destroyed, also end in an explosion and result in damage to the respective Ukrainian vehicle. As we've just seen, I find it a fascinating video that again shows one side is the propaganda we always see, like 10 approaches in a row, of which the Russians then claim they destroyed 10 vehicles. But we just saw, if there's no footage from surveillance drones where you can see that this vehicle actually exploded at the moment of impact, then it's often the case, as just observed, that even modern Russian fiber optic drones fail to inflict the expected damage that Russian propaganda desperately wants us to believe they are responsible for.